The Galactic Academy was a sprawling complex of sleek metallic structures and holographic projections floating amidst the stars on the edge of the nebula cluster. The Academy's primary hall, designed for hosting major exams and galactic conferences, gleamed under the shifting colors of the nebula outside. Inside, hundreds of cadets from various planets gathered, each representing a unique species with their own abilities and intellect. Today was the final examination in advanced navigation, and the tension was palpable. Rachel stood at the back of the hall, clutching her worn-out notebook and a mechanical pencil. Unlike the other cadets, who carried advanced holographic projectors and compact AI navigation units, she had chosen simplicity. A decision that had earned her countless skeptical glances throughout the course. As the only human cadet in the academy, she was used to being underestimated. Today was no exception. At the front of the hall, Professor Xylar, a towering figure with emerald skin and multifaceted eyes, stood before a massive holographic projection. The image displayed a vast, three-dimensional gravitational maze, a complex web of distortions caused by the gravitational waves emitted from a collapsing star. The objective was clear: chart a safe path through the maze to reach the opposite side before the gravitational shifts became too unpredictable, trapping anyone caught within. Professor Xylar's voice echoed through the hall, carrying a hint of disdain. "This examination is designed to test the limits of your navigation skills. You will face a gravitational anomaly field unlike any you have encountered before. Failure to chart a correct path will result in simulated destruction. You have 30 minutes to complete the task." The alien cadets around Rachel activated their holographic projectors, and colorful, complex graphs and equations filled the space above their desks. The devices hummed softly, calculating potential trajectories based on the constantly shifting gravitational pulses. Rachel, however, did not activate any advanced technology. Instead, she flipped open her notebook and drew a simple triangle, carefully marking the angles with her pencil. A snide voice interrupted her concentration. "Still using that primitive method, human?" It was Krill, a blue-skinned Zephyrian cadet with translucent tendrils for hair. Krill's device projected an intricate hologram of the gravitational map, constantly updating with data. "You'll never solve this with your crude geometry." Rachel didn't respond. She had learned long ago that arguing was pointless. Instead, she focused on the problem. The gravitational field seemed chaotic, with distortions shifting every few seconds. The holograms projected by the other cadets showed complex lines weaving in and out, but they failed to predict the next shift accurately. Professor Xylar glanced at Rachel's desk and narrowed his eyes. "Cadet Rachel," he sneered, "do you intend to solve a problem of galactic proportions with child's play drawings?" Rachel glanced up and met his gaze. "Sometimes the simplest approach works best, Professor," she replied, her voice calm but firm. He scoffed. "Your primitive methods might suffice on Earth, but this is a multi-dimensional gravitational matrix. Your geometry will not save you." Ignoring the professor's words, Rachel returned to her sketch. She noticed something the others didn't: an oscillation pattern. The gravitational waves pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. While the advanced holographic systems struggled to keep up, her hand-drawn lines began to form a pattern. She carefully traced a triangle between three gravitational nodes and noticed that the oscillation maintained a predictable sequence when the nodes were connected in a specific way. Time ticked away and tension mounted. Several alien cadets were already muttering in frustration as their holographic projections displayed error messages. Krill's device flickered, its algorithms overloaded with conflicting gravitational data. He slammed his hands on the desk, cursing softly in his native tongue. Rachel remained unfazed. She kept drawing, forming a network of interconnected triangles. Each represented a potential safe zone between gravitational pulses. She tested her theory on a smaller section of the map, predicting the next gravitational shift. As the field moved exactly as she calculated, a spark of confidence lit up her face. One of the other cadets, a Larkin named Dre, who had been struggling with his projector, noticed Rachel's calmness. "What are you doing?" he asked, curiosity overcoming his disdain. Rachel showed him her notebook. "The gravitational waves are rhythmic, not random. If you break the pattern into smaller segments, you can predict the next movement by calculating the angles between the nodes." Dre glanced back at his own device, which had completely failed to map the shifting field. That's simple, but effective. Professor Zeiler, overhearing the conversation, approached and looked at her sketches with disdain. That is not how galactic navigation is performed. Real science involves algorithms, data analysis, and multi-dimensional computations, not crude shapes. Rachel remained silent, focusing on completing the path. She marked key points along the maze, creating a series of interconnected triangular pathways. Krill, who had been observing her with a mix of irritation and curiosity, finally snapped. "You're wasting time. Your scribbles won't get us anywhere." Rachel didn't bother defending herself. Instead, she finished her calculations and circled the final triangle that connected the last node to the exit point. The bell rang, signaling the end of the exam. Professor Zeiler instructed the cadets to submit their completed maps. One by one, holographic projections displayed distorted paths, most leading to dead ends or directly into gravitational traps. When it was Rachel's turn, she handed in her notebook. The professor raised an eyebrow, inspecting the paper as if it were an artifact from a bygone era. He inserted the map into the simulation and watched as the path unfolded. To everyone's astonishment, the line traced the safest route through the gravitational maze, seamlessly navigating through each oscillation. Krill stared in disbelief. That can't be right." Professor Zeiler, visibly displeased but unable to refute the results, turned to Rachel. "Cadet Rachel, explain your method." "It's basic geometry," she explained, keeping her tone steady. "The gravitational distortions follow a rhythm. By calculating the angles and distances between each gravitational pulse, I could map a path that remains within the safe zones." Silence fell over the hall as the professor begrudgingly acknowledged her success. "While unorthodox, your method proved effective. Perhaps not all primitive techniques are useless after all." Rachel couldn't help but smile, not out of triumph, but relief. She knew that logic and simplicity sometimes outperformed complexity, even in the most advanced environments. As the other cadets whispered among themselves, Rachel quietly packed her notebook, knowing that she had once again proven that intelligence wasn't always about technology. It was about perception and using the tools one had effectively. The examination hall had emptied, but the tension lingered in the air like an echo. Rachel stood outside the academy, clutching her notebook tightly against her chest. The cool, metallic wind from the nebula station brushed against her face, a stark contrast to the heated glares she had received from the other cadets. Despite her success, the whispers of disbelief and resentment trailed behind her like shadows. Krill's mocking laughter echoed in her mind, reminding her that in their eyes, she remained nothing more than a primitive anomaly. A human who had somehow stumbled upon the right answer through sheer luck. The academy grounds were vast and meticulously structured, with towering spires of shimmering metal and floating platforms that connected different sections of the campus. Alien cadets of various species moved through the grounds, some with glowing eyes that scanned holographic projections, others with translucent wings that flickered in the ambient light. Rachel walked quickly, her eyes fixed straight ahead, determined to reach her quarters before any more confrontations could arise. As she rounded a corner, she heard rapid footsteps approaching from behind. Before she could react, Krill stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His blue skin glistened under the overhead lights, and his tendrils swayed with agitation. Behind him stood his usual entourage: Dre, the Larkin cadet with dark metallic scales, and Threx, a massive Gorgon with thick, armor-like skin. "So," Krill sneered, folding his arms across his chest, "how does it feel to be the Academy's new genius, or should I say, the luckiest human alive?" Rachel's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to maintain a calm expression. "It wasn't luck, Krill. It was calculation." "Calculation?" Krill laughed, a hollow, condescending sound. "You drew triangles on a piece of paper like some kind of cave dweller. This is a galactic academy, not a kindergarten. You think you're smart just because you got lucky once?" Dre stepped forward, his black eyes narrowing as he leaned closer to Rachel. "Or maybe she cheated," he said, his voice a low hiss. "Maybe that's why she won't explain her method. Maybe she got some secret tech hidden in that primitive notebook of hers." Rachel swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. I didn't cheat, she said, forcing herself to meet Dre's gaze. You saw my work. It was simple geometry. Simple geometry? Threk's deep voice rumbled like a distant storm. You think that's enough to outsmart our AI systems? You're lying. Before Rachel could respond, Krill reached out and snatched her notebook from her hands. Rachel gasped, her fingers clutching the empty air as Krill flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the crude sketches and lines. What's this? He said, holding up the page with the interconnected triangles. You call this advanced navigation? It's child's play. Give it back, Rachel said, her voice firm but controlled. Krill smirked, his eyes gleaming with malice. Or what? You'll draw more triangles and hope for another miracle? Before Rachel could react, Dre reached forward and shoved her shoulder. The impact sent her stumbling backward, her heels scraping against the metallic ground. Krill laughed, holding the notebook high above his head. Face it, Rachel, he said, his voice dripping with venom. You don't belong here. You're just a lucky primitive who thinks she's smarter than the rest of us. Rachel's fists clenched at her sides. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to fight back, to grab her notebook and run, but she forced herself to stand still. She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto Krill's. If you are really as smart as you think you are, she said, her voice cold and unwavering, you would have solved the puzzle without the AI. But you couldn't. None of you could. Krill's face darkened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Rachel thought he might hit her. Instead, he shoved the notebook into Dre's hands. Keep it, he said. She doesn't need it. She's already so smart. Before Rachel could protest, Dre tossed the notebook onto the ground and stomped on it, the pages crumpling under his heavy boot. Krill and Threx laughed as they walked away, their mocking voices echoing down the corridor. Rachel remained frozen, her eyes fixed on the mangled notebook. The pages were torn, the ink smeared, the triangles she had drawn now a mess of wrinkles and scuffs. Biting her lip to suppress the burning anger in her chest, she knelt down and gathered the torn pages, her fingers trembling. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. Rachel looked up to see Dre standing alone, his dark eyes fixed on the torn pages in her hands. For a moment, his expression softened, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Rachel," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Did you really use geometry, or was it something else?" Rachel met his gaze, her eyes hard and unyielding. "It was geometry," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." Dre hesitated, his gaze flicking to the ruined notebook. "If it was really that simple," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then why couldn't the AI solve it?" Rachel stood up, clutching the torn pages to her chest. "Because sometimes the simplest solutions are the hardest to see." Dre opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say another word, Professor Zyler's voice echoed through the Academy's intercom system. "All cadets report to the main hall for the results of the navigation exam." Dre cast one last uncertain glance at Rachel before turning and walking away, his footsteps echoing down the metallic corridor. Rachel took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and steadied herself. The examination was over, but the real test had only just begun. If she was going to prove herself, she would need more than a few scribbled triangles. She would need to show them that her mind was sharper than any AI algorithm, and that the simplest solutions could outsmart even the most advanced technology. But as she walked toward the main hall, the echoes of Krill's laughter lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that in the eyes of the Academy, she was still nothing more than a primitive human, fighting against a galaxy that refused to believe in her. Rachel stepped into the main hall, her fingers clutching the crumpled pages of her torn notebook. The vast room was packed with cadets from every corner of the galaxy, each one eager to hear the results of the navigation exam. Holographic screens floated above the stage, displaying the list of cadets and their respective scores. The air was tense with anticipation, and hushed whispers filled the space like a low electric hum. Professor Zylar stood at the center of the stage, his emerald skin shimmering beneath the artificial lights. His multifaceted eyes scanned the crowd, his expression hard and unyielding. Krill and his entourage stood near the front, their arms crossed, smug grins plastered across their faces. Dre, however, lingered at the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched. Rachel made her way to the back of the hall, avoiding eye contact with the other cadets. The anger and humiliation from Krill's attack still simmered beneath her skin, but she forced herself to focus. She had to stay calm, had to keep her mind clear. The exam wasn't over. Not yet. Professor Zyler's voice echoed through the hall, commanding immediate silence. The results of the navigation exam are now final. As expected, the majority of you failed to navigate through the gravitational anomaly field. The advanced AI systems proved insufficient in predicting the gravitational shifts, and many of you were unable to complete the course. A murmur of frustration swept through the crowd. Krill smirked, his eyes darting back to where Rachel stood, as if daring her to meet his gaze. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. However, Professor Zyler continued, his tone dripping with disdain, one cadet successfully navigated the course using what can only be described as unorthodox methods. Cadet Rachel of Earth stepped forward. The entire hall fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her, some filled with shock, others with contempt. Krill's jaw dropped, his smirk vanishing instantly. Dre's eyes widened, a flicker of something that resembled admiration flashing across his face. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat dry. She forced her feet to move, each step feeling like a march toward a firing squad. As she reached the front of the hall, she stood before Professor Zyler, her chin held high despite the weight of every staring eye. Professor Zyler's gaze bore into her, his expression cold and unyielding. "Cadet Rachel," he said, holding up her torn notebook, "explain to the assembly how you managed to solve a navigation puzzle that advanced AI systems failed to decode." Rachel's eyes flicked to the notebook, the crumpled pages barely hanging together. The ink had smeared, the lines of her geometric calculations blurred and distorted, but the logic behind them was still clear in her mind. "It wasn't about technology," Rachel began, her voice steady but firm. "The gravitational anomalies followed a predictable pattern, one that was masked by the intensity of the pulses. The AI systems were too advanced, they overcalculated, overanalyzed, but the pattern was simple. It was all about the angles, the oscillations. Once I mapped the gravitational nodes using basic geometry, the path became clear. A wave of incredulous murmurs swept through the crowd. Krill shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides. "That's ridiculous!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. "You expect us to believe that some primitive human technique outperformed galactic AI systems? Impossible." Professor Zyler's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Quiet, Cadet Krill," he said, his voice sharp as glass. "The results speak for themselves." Krill's face flushed, his tendrils quivering with rage. Dre took a step back, his gaze darting between Rachel and Krill, as if torn between the two. Rachel took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I connected the gravitational nodes using triangles," she continued, her eyes fixed on Professor Zyler. Each triangle represented a stable zone, a point of relative gravitational stability. By calculating the angles and measuring the distances, I was able to trace a path that remained within those zones, even as the anomalies shifted. Professor Zyler's eyes flicked to the notebook, his expression unreadable. "You mapped the gravitational nodes using basic geometry?" "Yes," Rachel said. "Simple, but effective." A bitter laugh echoed through the hall. It was Krill. He pushed forward, his blue skin glistening with sweat. "You're lying," he spat, his eyes burning with fury. "There's no way that crude technique could outsmart our systems. You cheated!" Rachel's jaw clenched, her fists tightening at her sides. "I didn't cheat," she said, her voice rising. "I observed. I calculated. While you relied on your AI to do all the thinking, I actually used my brain." Krill lunged forward, but Threx grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Let it go," Threx muttered, his deep voice a low growl. Professor Zyler raised a hand, silencing the hall. "Enough," he said, his tone final. He turned to Rachel, his eyes colder than the void of space. "While your method was unconventional, it was undeniably effective. However, the Academy values consistency and precision. One victory does not make you a master navigator." Rachel's stomach twisted, the brief spark of triumph extinguished by his words. "The next challenge," Professor Zyler continued, "will be even more complex. The gravitational anomalies will not be fixed points. They will oscillate in unpredictable patterns, and you will be required to map a path in real time with no prior observation period. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Krill's eyes lit up, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Let's see her draw triangles this time," he sneered. Professor Xylar handed Rachel her torn notebook, his eyes locking onto hers. "You have 24 hours to prepare," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And this time, your primitive geometry will not save you." Rachel took the notebook, her fingers trembling. As she turned to leave the stage, she could feel the eyes of every cadet burning into her back, some with contempt, others with curiosity. Krill's gaze followed her like a predator stalking its prey, his expression dark and twisted. As Rachel stepped outside, the cold wind stung her face, the artificial breeze carrying the scent of ozone and metal. She moved quickly, her mind racing. 24 hours. The next challenge would be more intense, more unpredictable. The nodes would no longer remain fixed points. The gravitational field would oscillate, shift, and pulse without warning. Rachel glanced down at her notebook, her heart pounding. The torn pages fluttered in the wind, each one a reminder of her struggle to prove herself in a world that refused to believe in her capabilities. The Academy had dismissed her as primitive, a simple human with primitive methods. But she had seen the pattern beneath the chaos, the rhythm hidden in the gravitational waves, and if she could find the rhythm again, she could map the path. She had to. Taking a deep breath, Rachel straightened her spine and marched toward the navigation lab. The other cadets could mock her, Professor Xylar could underestimate her, but she would not back down. Not now. Not when the next challenge was looming on the horizon. A storm of gravitational chaos that only she could navigate. And this time, she would prove that her so-called primitive geometry was more powerful than any advanced AI in the galaxy. The navigation lab loomed before Rachel like a fortress of glass and steel. Inside, rows of holographic stations flickered with multi-dimensional projections, each one displaying a swirling matrix of gravitational nodes oscillating in unpredictable patterns. The air was heavy with tension, the room filled with cadets preparing for the next challenge. Krill stood near the front, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on the holographic display as he conferred with Dre and Thrax. Drex's brow furrowed in concentration as he adjusted the holographic controls, his dark eyes darting from one shifting node to another. Thrax, massive and imposing, stood like a silent sentinel, his arms crossed as he watched the display. Rachel moved to the farthest station, away from the cluster of cadets. The memory of Krill's attack still lingered in her mind, his taunts echoing like a haunting refrain. She placed her crumpled notebook on the console, smoothing the torn pages with her trembling fingers. The ink had smeared, and several of her calculations were now obscured by dirt and scuff marks. But the logic was still there, embedded in the angles and lines she had drawn. The new challenge was projected above the console, a three-dimensional map of the gravitational maze. Unlike the previous static nodes, these nodes pulsated with erratic intensity, shifting positions in a chaotic rhythm. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she watched the patterns unfold. The nodes no longer adhered to predictable angles. They swirled, collided, and reformed, like a storm of invisible forces. Krill's mocking voice echoed from across the room. "So what's the plan this time, Rachel?" Krill said, his grin as sharp as a knife. "More triangles and scribbles? Maybe you can draw a circle and hope it leads you out of the maze." Dre chuckled, his eyes fixed on the holographic map. "Yeah, good luck with that. These nodes are moving too fast for primitive geometry." Rachel ignored them, her jaw clenched. She traced her finger along the torn pages of her notebook, her mind racing. The gravitational nodes were oscillating in complex patterns, overlapping and colliding in rapid succession. The previous method of connecting static nodes through triangles wouldn't work here. But as she watched, a faint rhythm emerged. Subtle, almost imperceptible. She grabbed her pencil and drew a series of circles around the nodes, marking each point where the gravitational waves intersected. If she could isolate the oscillations and identify the moments of stability, she could map a path that moved with the flow of the gravitational waves rather than against them. The door to the lab slid open, and Professor Xylar entered, his emerald eyes scanning the room. His gaze fell upon Rachel, and a cold smirk curled his lips. "Cadets," he announced, his voice echoing through the lab, "your challenge begins now. The gravitational matrix has been intensified. The nodes will not only oscillate, but also emit destabilizing pulses that can disrupt navigation systems. Your objective is to navigate through the maze without being trapped in a gravitational well. You have 60 minutes. The room fell silent as the countdown timer appeared above each station, ticking down from 60 minutes. The holographic nodes pulsed with a menacing rhythm, each oscillation sending ripples through the matrix. Rachel gripped her pencil, her eyes darting between the holographic map and her sketches. The oscillations followed a complex sequence, but each node had a brief moment of stability, a fraction of a second when the gravitational pulse weakened before shifting to a new position. That was her opening. Krill activated his holographic scanner, his face twisted in concentration as the AI system analyzed the gravitational field. Come on, he muttered, his fingers dancing over the controls. The AI projected a potential path through the maze, a jagged line weaving through the nodes. But as Krill initiated the simulation, the path collapsed, the line disintegrating as the nodes shifted positions. "Damn it!" Krill cursed, slamming his fist against the console. "This is impossible!" Dre and Threx exchanged nervous glances. Dre leaned closer, his voice a strained whisper. "Maybe we should just follow the AI's calculations. It's bound to get it right eventually." Krill's eyes darkened, his jaw clenched. "No, we can beat this." Rachel blocked out the noise, her focus sharpening to a razor's edge. She circled each node where the oscillations intersected, marking the exact moment when the gravitational waves synchronized, creating a temporary zone of stability. If she could string those moments together, she could trace a path that moved with the gravitational flow rather than against it. She drew a line from the first node to the second, her pencil pressing hard against the paper. The line curved and twisted, bending to accommodate the shifting gravitational pulses. As she mapped each segment, her breathing slowed, her mind syncing with the rhythm of the gravitational waves. 30 minutes remained. The other cadets grew restless, their voices rising in panic. Holographic projections flashed with warning signals, and several cadets abandoned their stations, unable to decode the maze. Krill's face was flushed, his fists clenched as he glared at the holographic map. "This is impossible," he shouted, slamming his hand against the console. "The nodes are moving too fast." Professor Xylar stood near the back of the lab, his arms folded across his chest, his expression impassive. His eyes remained fixed on Rachel, watching as she continued to map her path, her pencil moving in smooth, controlled strokes. 15 minutes left. Rachel's hand ached from gripping the pencil so tightly, but she refused to stop. The gravitational waves pulsed faster now, each oscillation threatening to collapse her path. But she adjusted, recalibrated, drawing smaller, more precise lines that curved around each node like a river flowing around rocks. 5 minutes left. Sweat dripped down Rachel's forehead, her breathing shallow and rapid. The gravitational pulses reached their peak intensity, the nodes vibrating with chaotic energy. Krill's AI system crashed, the holographic map flickering and then going dark. "No!" Krill shouted, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. He turned to Dre, his eyes wild. "We're running out of time!" Dre shook his head, his hands trembling. "I can't map it. The nodes are shifting too fast." Rachel pressed the pencil to the final node, her eyes locked under the last intersection point. The gravitational waves pulsed, the oscillations reaching a fever pitch. With a final, decisive stroke, she connected the last line, completing the path. The countdown timer hit 0. The gravitational nodes froze in place, the holographic map dissolving into a blank screen. The room fell into stunned silence. Professor Xylar stepped forward. His eyes locked onto Rachel's torn notebook. "Cadet Rachel," he said, his voice cold and deliberate, "submit your path." Rachel lifted her notebook, her hands shaking as she handed it to Professor Xylar. He examined the pages, his expression inscrutable. Krill's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Dre stood motionless, his jaw clenched tight. Professor Xylar inserted the notebook into the scanner, the lines and angles projected onto the central screen. The room held its breath as the simulation began. One by one, the gravitational nodes reappeared, their oscillations matching the path Rachel had drawn. The path moved through each node, curving around the destabilizing pulses, aligning perfectly with each moment of stability. As the simulation reached the final node, the path held, unbroken. Professor Xylar's eyes narrowed, his jaw tight. "Impressive," he said, his voice void of warmth. "Cadet Rachel has successfully completed the challenge using unconventional methods." Rachel exhaled, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. Krill's eyes blazed with fury, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Dre's face remained expressionless, his gaze fixed on the screen, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Professor Xylar handed Rachel her notebook, his expression hard and unyielding. "The next challenge," he said, his voice cold and precise, "will be even more demanding. And this time the nodes will not oscillate in predictable patterns. The field will be completely randomized." Rachel swallowed, her fingers tightening around the notebook. The next challenge would be the final test, a trial by chaos. And this time, even her geometry might not be enough. The navigation lab was dark, its vast expanse illuminated only by the soft blue glow of the holographic nodes pulsing rhythmically in the center of the room. Rachel stood alone at her station, her gaze fixed on the chaotic map projected before her. Unlike the previous simulations, the gravitational nodes now pulsed erratically, each oscillation unpredictable and without any discernible pattern. The room was empty, silent, save for the hum of the holographic projector and the soft rustling of her torn notebook pages. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. Professor Xylar's words echoed in her mind. This time, the nodes will not oscillate in predictable patterns. The field will be completely randomized. Rachel gripped her pencil, her knuckles white as she stared at the screen. She had spent the last 12 hours analyzing the data, scouring her notebook for any possible method to navigate through the chaos. But every calculation led to a dead end. Without a pattern, her geometry was useless. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think. Her mind drifted back to the first challenge, to the moment she had first noticed the rhythmic oscillations in the gravitational field. Back then, the nodes had moved in predictable sequences, forming a pattern that she could map using triangles. But now, the oscillations were erratic, each node shifting without warning, overlapping, colliding, creating a maze of gravitational chaos. Rachel opened her eyes, her gaze falling to her notebook. The pages were covered in scribbled lines and shapes, triangles and circles, each one a failed attempt to map the oscillations. She flipped to the last page, her pencil hovering above the blank paper. If the nodes no longer moved in a predictable pattern, then the only way to navigate the field was to anticipate their movement in real time. But how? The door to the lab slid open and Professor Xylar stepped inside, his emerald eyes fixed on her. His expression was cold, impassive, but there was a glint of something darker beneath the surface, something akin to contempt. "Cadet Rachel," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "The final challenge begins now. You will have 30 minutes to navigate through the gravitational matrix. The nodes will oscillate at random intervals, each one emitting destabilizing pulses that can throw you off course. If you fail to reach the exit before the gravitational field collapses, you will be disqualified from the Galactic Navigation Program." Rachel swallowed, her throat dry. She nodded, her jaw clenched as she turned back to the screen. The countdown timer flashed above her head, 30 minutes ticking away with relentless precision. "Good luck," Professor Xylar said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You will need it." The doors slid shut behind him, leaving Rachel alone in the darkness. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to focus. The nodes flickered before her, each one pulsing with erratic, unpredictable intensity. Her mind raced, searching for any pattern, any rhythm hidden within the chaos. She lifted her pencil and pressed it to the blank page. If she couldn't map the nodes using fixed points, then she would have to map them using movement. She drew a single circle, then another, each one representing a node's oscillation range. As she connected the circles with curved lines, a thought struck her. The nodes weren't moving Rachel's eyes widened. Of course, The gravitational field wasn't truly random. Each node's oscillation was a reaction to the pulse emitted by the previous node. It was a chain of cause and effect, each node reacting to the gravitational wave sent by its predecessor. She adjusted her pencil, her hand moving swiftly across the page. She mapped each node's oscillation range, drawing a network of intersecting circles that overlapped and connected like a spider's web. The lines twisted and curved, forming a labyrinthine path that wove through the gravitational waves. 20 minutes left. The gravitational pulses intensified, the nodes vibrating violently as they collided and reformed. The holographic map shuddered, distorting as the gravitational waves rippled through the matrix. Rachel's eyes darted from her sketch to the screen, her mind working in overdrive to anticipate the next collision. Sweat dripped down her forehead, her breathing shallow as she traced the path in her notebook, her pencil moving frantically across the page. The gravitational waves surged, crashing against each other like tidal waves in a storm. The nodes trembled, each one emitting a pulse that sent shockwaves through the field. 15 minutes left. The room trembled as the gravitational field neared its peak intensity. Rachel's hand shook, her fingers cramping as she struggled to keep up with the oscillations. The path was narrowing, each node's range shrinking as the gravitational waves grew stronger. She bit her lip, her pulse hammering in her ears as she drew the final line, connecting the last node to the exit point. 10 minutes left. The gravitational field began to collapse, the nodes spinning out of control, their oscillations growing more erratic. Rachel's breath hitched, her heart racing as she watched the nodes converge, forming a vortex of gravitational waves at the center of the matrix. The vortex pulsed, its gravitational pull intensifying as it sucked in the surrounding nodes, dragging them toward its core. Rachel clenched her fists, her eyes fixed on the screen as the vortex expanded, threatening to consume the entire field. 5 minutes left. The room quaked, the holographic map flickering as the gravitational vortex reached critical mass. Rachel's mind raced, her eyes darting from the screen to her sketch, searching for a way out. The path she had drawn was closing, the nodes collapsing into the vortex, their oscillations spiraling into chaos. 3 minutes left. Rachel grabbed her pencil, her eyes locked onto the final line. If she couldn't escape the vortex, then she would have to use it. She traced a curved line around the vortex, aligning it with the gravitational waves. If she could time it perfectly, she could ride the wave, using the vortex's pull to slingshot herself through the exit point. 2 minutes left. The gravitational vortex howled, its pull growing stronger as it absorbed the remaining nodes. Rachel's chest heaved, her fingers trembling as she drew the final curve, connecting the path to the exit point. The line twisted and spiraled, weaving through the vortex like a thread through a needle. 1 minute left. Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she activated the path. The screen erupted in a blaze of light as the gravitational field surged, the vortex's pull threatening to rip her path apart. But the line held, curving and twisting with the gravitational waves, moving with the flow rather than against it. The countdown timer hit 0. The gravitational field collapsed, the vortex imploding in a flash of light. The room fell silent, the holographic map dissolving into darkness. Rachel's chest heaved, her hands shaking as she dropped the pencil, her eyes closing as the adrenaline drained from her body. The door slid open, and Professor Zeiler stepped inside. His expression was inscrutable, his eyes fixed on Rachel as he approached her station. He picked up her notebook, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic lines and curves, the web of intersecting paths that formed her escape route. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You completed the course," he said, his voice low and cold. "You navigated through a randomized gravitational matrix, using nothing but primitive geometry and instinct." Rachel swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes, Professor." Professor Zeiler's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the notebook. "Impressive," he said, his voice hard as stone. "But remember this, Cadet Rachel. Survival in the Galactic Academy is not about intelligence or luck. It's about power. And you are still nothing more than a primitive human." He dropped the notebook onto the console, his eyes burning with contempt. "You may have passed this test," he said, his voice a low, venomous hiss, "but you will never be one of us." Rachel met his gaze, her chin held high. "I don't need to be one of you," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "I just need to be better." Without another word, Professor Zeiler turned and strode out of the lab, his footsteps echoing down the empty hall. Rachel watched him go, her jaw set, her heart still racing. Then she picked up her notebook, her eyes scanning the chaotic web of lines and curves that had led her through the gravitational maze. A small, triumphant smile curved her lips. She had done it. She had proven that simplicity could outsmart complexity, that logic could outmaneuver chaos, and in the silence of the empty lab, she knew that her battle had only just begun.